to stop the recording, or excuse me, I want to stop the recording. When it comes to the exposition of Christian love, I dare say that Brümmer and Ord are the tops in the field today. Brümmer's third, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, his thoroughly relational concept of love is an apt portrayal that I will appropriate in my depiction of love within this essay as fully kenotic. I'm using the conjugation of kenosis there, which is the Greek word that often is translated as poured out, but which I have argued for the last 15 or so years in published essays, does not at all times mean poured out. It means more of an infilling, a, a, a filling up, you could say, than merely a self-emptying. Of course, we encounter that in the Philippians, the great Philippians hymn by Paul, or at least by Paul's the presumed writer named Paul. Regardless, this essay will expound on a fully kenotic, that is, a kenotically donated and self-giving type of love. After all, in many ways, the utmost expression of love is the utmost gift of self. The utmost gift of self is hence a kenotic donation as I'm developing it in this paper. This terminology is original with me, and there shouldn't be any precedent in your mind with regard to the connotations and so forth, because this is original with me. The fully kenotic concept of God's love is fully consistent, however, with Ord's portrayal of an essentially kenotic God. Notably, Ord and I both began writing, and I'm not sure which one came first. I want to claim primacy, but nevertheless, that's probably just my nature. But regardless, we both began writing and expressing kenosis and kenotic activity as essentially infilling and self-giving in or about the year 2008. Indeed. But this portrayal of a fully kenotic God is consistent with this essentially kenotic God, who has an eternal nature marked by others centered and others empowering uncontrolling love. This uncontrolling love as the contingentist, which is also a word that I've coined to refer to processes and or even instances that are marked by contingency inherently. So it's the contingentist occurrence, if you will. And I appellate Ord as a contingentist, that is one who advocates contingency in all of his writings and so forth. That's again my own terminology. But nevertheless, as Ord likes to say, this uncontrolling love necessarily provides full freedom and agency to each species within the natural world, especially human animals, with God working to empower and inspire creation toward well-being and wholeness, to which I add the furtherance of complexity. Regardless, I do declare, of our attitude about religion, there is something very compelling about this image of self-giving as the epitome of love. One can hardly argue with it, in fact, for there's enormous power within it. In what follows, I will seek to build upon the insights regarding love by both Brümmer and Ord, with insights additionally by one Karawatala, or Pope John Paul II, as he's more popularly known as. I seek to illustrate the notion that God's canonically donated love is a synergistic symbiosis enacted by the spirit of creativity that achieves greater evolutionary results combined than either aspect of the symbiosis alone. It's an emergent property, you could say, and to use a Platonian type of inference or reference there. This means then that God's canonically donated love is both productive of emergent entities and effectual for the derivation of greater complexity within those entities in the natural environment. This canonically donated love onsets in evolving fertility, which most proximately is a result of the panentheistic relationship of God and the world. Now, of course, this panentheistic relationship was initially wrought by God's donation of himself into chaotic matter eons ago, which caused chaotic matter to proverbially leap forth and become structured and orderly thereafter. Again, billions of years it took for this to occur, but proverbially speaking, leap forth. And is now continually upheld and sustained by the repetitive impartation of his very self through the imbibification, another word that I've coined, of the Spirit, which merely refers to an imbibing, a total immersion. Imbibification is the process of imbibing in my terminology here. I, I create words when I don't know what else to say. But nevertheless, thereafter marked by the embeddedness of the Spirit, which is the agent of contingency within evolution, the natural world progressed in a serpentine manner in the advancement toward greater complexity, of which Homo sapiens sapiens are the pinnacle, at least at present anyway. In fact, God's world is teeming with randomness. It is, I like to say, smothered in contingency, pelted with it, you could say. It's both smothered and stuffed with it. As such, it's marked by, again, my wording, contingentous entities, which are themselves marked by excessive amounts of contingency. So then, things do not happen according to divine plan. God intends and intended once upon a time for entities. I'm using the term entities there intentionally, not organisms or individuals, because of the connotations that those terms have. The entities doesn't have. An entity can be biological or it can be abiotic. Either one is still an entity. God intends and intended for entities to cooperate with his canonically donated love. I did not originate the terminology of love as self-donation, which is a principle upon which my canonically donated love is based. Wathala did. Neither did I originate the terminology of self-giving, uncontrolling love. Tom Ward did. However, if one, or rather, I should say, indeed, if one looks at Watala's love and responsibility, they can find several ways that he applies Thomistic principles to the modern study of love as self donation, which is, according to his recent judgment, a defining characteristic of love with relationship to the other, whatever the other might be. According to him, that is Watala, authentic love must include both an objective and a subjective dimension, which Watala refers to as the law of the lover. This conceptioning of authentic self-donating love by Watala entails, in my own reckoning, that the spirit go outside of herself, ad extra, to find, to both find and produce a fuller existence in another entity, whereby the epic of evolution, I'm using the term epic there in a very distinguished sense. I'm not using it in the sense of a story that's already the end's already foretold. Generally speaking, the epics of history, when you start reading them, you know what's going to happen. Correct? You follow me there? But that's not the way I'm using the term epic, the phrase epic of evolution here. But nevertheless, by the spirit going outside of herself ad extra, the epic of evolution is empowered. It should be noted also that Watala's self-donating love is a strong correlate with Ord's characteristic of uncontrolling love. Accordingly, I will employ both terms, or at least their application, in what I have come to refer to as canonically donated love. This depiction is based fundamentally upon the notion that kenosis of the spirit amounts to a self-giving, literally a pouring out of the spirit or an infilling with reckless abandonment, and not a mere self-emptying or a self-abnegation. Tom Ord and I both in picturing kenosis as essentially self-giving, or to use my terminology, pouring out or an infilling, or even as a self-donation since about the year 2008. I'm going to skip over that. Skip over that. Okay. Charles Hartshorne is right when he opines, shifting gears here, that theologians have never really taken seriously the proposition that God is love. Historically speaking, people have always had a hard time with love, that is, dealing with it. All the more so when speaking of divine love, that we can often not either empirically detect or deter or discern directly mentally. In recent years, Ord has written nearly a half dozen books regarding God's love, its effects, as well as what it effects in the world. In noting that the love of God is canonically donated, I intend to highlight that God not only gives us love itself, but also Himself in the very act of love. Further, in characterizing love as self giving, I intend to once again draw attention to the fact that God gives of Himself liberally to His creation and to the creatures of His creation. He imparts part of Himself to it and them, both in a kenotic, that is, a self giving, self donated, or infilling manner. Hence, I say that God's love is canonically donated. Picking up Ord's illustration of love as being uncontrolling, I gather from him that he means that God gives out of his fullness, but does not insist on controlling the responses of his creation to his impartation of love. Hence the designation of uncontrolling. So then, God does not insist on having control. In point of fact, due to his nature primarily being canonically donated to self-giving love, I assert God cannot totally control other entities, be they animate or not, although he could and does lure, woo, behoove, and beckon entities toward himself. Not simply will not control, but cannot control. That is the radical assertion made everywhere by Ord, and especially in this newest title, God Can't. Pick it up. I'll get a royalty. I'm teasing. No, but regardless, and I join him there in it. Indeed, I do. I will argue in what follows for a notion of love that is canonically donated, self-giving, creative and uncontrolling. I argue that this uncontrolling, canonically donated, self-giving, and creative love is principally pneumatologically derived and based upon an imbibification of matter with the Spirit of God, which on set once upon a time the panentheistic relationship that God is in the world, but not totally encircled by it, so to speak. Right? We all know what panentheism means. I'm sure you know better than I do, but now, there is a danger that such a position could be labeled pantheism, but if one were to constantly consciously stipulate at all times that God is in the world thoroughly, but at the same time more than the world, that distorting moniker can be avoided. In so doing, I further will be fleshing out the statement by Stephen G. Post to the effect that the energy of love should be studied intently by religion. Skipping down, this idea of a synergistic symbiosis of canonically donated love is highly instructive because it invokes the terminology of close, long-term biological associations, wherein both entities benefit from the relationship, which is known as most of you probably will know as mutualism. Or alternatively, it could refer to long-term biological association wherein one entity is benefited, but the other entity is neither deleteriously affected nor beneficially affected, which is known as commensalism. Although parasitism could very well be imagined in this type of biological relationship that I'm here envisioning, I choose not to explicate on that because I view love to be inherently self-giving, other-centered, and others-empowering, which would deny the import or the possibility of parasitism altogether. In many ways, I posit that the commensalistic association just spoken of is an apt metaphor for our relationship with God, in part because I honestly, at the end of the day, cannot see how God is very much so moved by our influence upon Him. That's probably my Southern Baptist baggage, but I admit to that. But nevertheless, right. I just can't see how God can benefit from our reciprocated love. So I favor a commensalistic relationship. So what's love got to do with it? Skipping down some here because I'm getting short on time. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay, here we go. In what follows, I preserve Ord's insights into love largely, and I mention such here so as to later build upon Ord's definition of love, wherein he asserts to act intentionally in sympathetic, empathetic response to others, including God, to promote our overall well-being is the essence of love. Ord breaks this down into several parts. You can read this later. You can read this later. The last phrase, however, of Ord's definition of love, to promote overall well-being, highlights the positive character of love's aim, that is well-being. To promote well-being is to increase flourishing in at least one of the following dimensions: a person's dispositions, his or her habits, or his or her character. Unlike the great Anders Nygren, who divvies up love into eros, agape, and philos, I view that distinction to be bunk, just total bunk. I do not divvy love up into various types, be it agape, eros, or philos. I follow Ord in noting that agape is simply one form of love, according to the biblical witness, and as such, it's not the be all, end all substance of love. Agape is just one of the multitude of ways that we humans may self givingly and intentionally respond to others to promote well being. Agapastic love, to invoke Persian terminology, harkening back to Mr. Philip, um, may well be full orbed love that Ord mentions in his text from 2010, but I would prefer to call it full ordered love. In my conception, full ordered love would encompass what is ordinarily contained within the definition of agape, but it would also include eros, for the latter is the love of co-laborment. Get that? Eros love necessarily involves an other, so it involves co-laborment, which we see everywhere in the biological world. So I think eros love, if we're going to use that terminology, is highly apropos for the biological world. Indeed, it is. In my appropriation of the term eros love, it would be the type of love that has the desire to, for example, expand one's territory or one's domain, which makes it applicable to the modern theory of evolution by natural selection. Indeed, indeed. That is self-giving love in its entirety and a proper demonstration of it. We're not just reservoirs of love, as Nygren would say. We're also generators of self-giving, self-donated, kenotic love. Orden Watala would entirely agree with that contention. For kenotic, self-donating, and self-giving love is inherently relational. I'm winding up here. I'm winding up here. Self-giving, it should be noted. Let me see. Let me skip down from that. Now, I've highlighted eros love to heretofore and agape love using those Nygrenian type terms, but my understanding of full ordered love would also include dimensions of filial love. Philia, if we must retain the differentiation at all, could be akin to mutualism or commensalism in biology, especially since filial love has historically been associated with friendship or with interrelatedness in the natural world. While agape or eros might benefit from cooperation, reciprocity, and mutuality, those two forms of love do not require any of those three nouns. But philia does, flatly. I contend, in fact, that the kenosis of the Spirit into creation amounts to self-giving, betrothed love through self-donation. Self-giving, betrothed love through self-donation. Wrapping it up here, wrapping it up, wrapping it up. Following Orden Watala again, since God commands that we show self-giving, self-donating love, we therefore indeed have the ability to love others as canonically donating entities, just as God himself does. When we act as genuine conduits and amplifiers, note not simply a channel or a reservoir, as Nygren would say, of God's self-donating, self-giving love, we can truly and entirely and infinitely love others, just as God does. Therefore, and thereby, self-love is transformed by God's impartation of self-donating and self-giving love. And through that impartation, we're empowered canonically to love others in a manner akin to how God loves us. I would like to close by saying that C.S. Lewis is at least half right when he points out that there's a gift love and so forth. There is a gift love indeed, and it is a mark, of all of our lives outward, in that we can canonically empowered by God self-donate and self-give our very beingness to others via canonic donation, just like unto how God always does it. Now, of course, since we're time-bound, necessarily human creatures, we cannot expect that we will always love alike unto how God does, because we do not have an eternal and unchanging nature that's necessarily inclined toward love. However, we're always able, at least, to do it. Always able to do it. We're always able to self-donatingly and canonically love others. Indeed. I think I'll wrap it up there and open up the floor. I've gone on a little bit on my time. I apologize, Dr. Dombrowski.
It's okay. We did a great job and close to the 20 minutes. I wonder if I could ask one question initially.
Yes, sir.
At one point you noticed it too, that you're defending commensalism, right, rather than mutualism in the God-world relationship. And I'm wondering whether or not that hurts your case, because it seems like at that point you were falling back into traditional classical theism, the God's unmoved and cannot be affected by us and so on. I take it that most process theists are dipolar rather than monopolar theists. So if you have this distinction between God as permanent but not changing, active but not passive, and so on, that's exactly what bothers most process theists.
All right.
So that maybe not in God's existence, God may not be affected by us, but in God's actuality, in other words, how God exists, is it not the case that God-world relationship is closer to mutualism than it is to commensalism? You notice this as a problem, so I wonder if you could respond to that.
That's a very interesting question, Dr. Dombrowski. I'm taking the bipolar concept of God and I'm trying to apply it. Perhaps I'm not as clear as I should be, but nevertheless, the dipolar, not bipolar. I guess it would be bipolar to some people, but the dipolar concept, that being that God's eternal nature is not fundamentally altered, because it's an unchanging eternal nature inclined toward love, necessarily the case. Now, but of course, his dipolar nature, or his consequent nature, you could say, perhaps I'm not clear enough with that, Dr. Dombrowski. I might need to revisit this and clean it up and polish it and make that more explicit. But I will note that I sort of jumped through. This is an abridged version of a longer essay, and I even abridged this abridgment. So I'm not sure how coherent it is, right? And I apologize for any implicities in the text, but I agree with what you're intimating there, sir. I do indeed. Yes, that we do have an effect on God, but I want to reserve his eternal, unchanging nature, because that's the foundation that I think of the regularities in the world. Does that make sense? Does that make better sense, Dr. Dombrowski?
Yes, it does. So that the unchanging part is what Whitehead calls the primordial nature, or Hartshorne calls God's existence. Yeah. So I think if we talk the terms through, I think your view is, very similar to Whitehead's and Hartshorne's. Yes.
Okay.
Anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah, just kind of ditto that the consequent nature of God is, I think of it, as a new student of this, as kind of recycled into existing God, that God is changing because of the consequences of our actions, so that this is an evolutionary deity that is changing and evolving with us. Yet there are certain features that remain the same: omniscience, omnipresence, not omnipotence. Wow. So that's kind of my ABC view of that. So I don't know how you would see that.
I actually agree. I actually like what you said there. I like the idea that God. I'm a 2/3 or a 3/4 omni person, I guess you could say. I belie the entirety of the idea of omnipotence, because that creates the problem of evil manifold times over again. But if you deny omnipotence, that gives you a way out of the problem of evil. But I do like to reserve the idea that God is all-knowing of all possibilities. Whereas God knows possibilities, what actually will occur is contingent to use my favorite term there, upon the creaturely, and I'm using creature and creaturely there in order to be somewhat fluid with, or with ancient terminology, so to speak. But the consequent, I guess you could say, his omniscience depends upon the free will, so to speak, to enact in any given potentiality by the choice of the actor, right? Omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence. I believe entirely in the omnipresence of God, because again, the Spirit, I contend, is poured out into chaotic matter, and therefore we live in a deified world, so to speak, right? That's the spark of the divine that I contend that theologians always talk about, but never really illustrate very well. Does that approach your question, Byron?
Yeah, yeah, it does. And I have a follow-up at a little bit different angle on that. I recently read a critique of process theology that said that, actually words theology, that said that, look, I mean, kenosis makes some sense, but the incarnation of Christ is like not the same. It's pretty different. You know, the fact of incarnational Christianity is a different idea from kenosis. That kenosis is a God who is withdrawing in a sense and pouring himself into it, versus the incarnation where God is coming into it physically, embodying as the incarnate Christ. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, in fact. I go back to my foundational, for me anyway. This is my first publication back in 2006. Um, the Kenosis of the Spirit into Creation, back when I was in my first PhD program at Regent University studying under Amos Young. I have such a great pedigree. I mean, I've got to toot some horns here, what have you. But Amos Young and Philip Clayton, and all those guys. I mean, I've got such great pedigree. But regardless, when I was studying under Amos Young, I published a paper in a journal article. I can't remember the peer-reviewed journal article. I can't remember what it is right now. My brain doesn't work very well. I'm brain damaged, by the way, severely and massively so. So please excuse me for my difficulties here. But nevertheless, I published a paper reimagining the terminology of kenosis, and I went back to the Hebrew roots of kenosis, and also, of course, exegeted the Greek behind kenosis that Paul employs in the kenotic hymn. And I argued from that exegesis and from the background of the terminology and so forth that it's literally a pouring out or an infilling, and not a withdrawal. So reimagining in application of that infilling or pouring out, so to speak, reimagining the incarnation, I see that's very consonant with my view. Does that make sense?
I think by changing that terminology, I think you're right.
Right. I mean,
vivification is very nice. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I fight battles daily with misappropriations and misunderstandings with my own understanding of kenosis, what have you, because as you know, lady and gentlemen, I should say, people interpret the words you use to their own context. And that term kenosis has such a long historical baggage cart, so to speak, that it's hard to change. I mean, it's only been 15 years, and it stood the test of time. I mean, heck, Ord adopted it, so he's run with it too. So like that's where I claim my primacy, so to speak. But anyway, does that answer your question, Byron?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Bradford. Very interesting paper. So I wonder if we could move now to Byron Belitsas, and he's going to be talking on the topic, Thinking Through the Unthinkable, David Ray Griffin.
I'll be right back.
Bradford, I was thinking during your paper that in many ways you're revitalizing the Greeks, that one of the classic tensions was the idea that in Aristotle, having a sense of yourself and being proud of your accomplishments is a good thing, as long as you don't stumble over into hubris, right?
Right.
And that the allegation was that in Christianity, you have this idea of what always giving of yourself and emptying of yourself and self-negation was a virtue. But I take it you're trying to combat that sort of
I am.
distinction.
Yes,
Is that right? Yeah, yeah,
exactly. I am, Dr. D. I am indeed. Yes, sir.
yeah.
But
And also
I
trying to bring Eros back, because the
bring
allegation
Eros.
is that Christianity,
Banished it. Right.
yeah, you banished it. Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
Eros is something to be suppressed in popular Christianity. I want to exalt and glorify Eros. I really do.
Yeah.
Right. I think it to be consonant with the biological view of life. I mean, really,
Mm.
because I mean, all creatures operate on the basis of ultimately self-need, right? So it's an acquisitive type of endeavor. Does that make sense, Dr. D?
Yes, it does. Yeah, yeah. And I can see why you have criticisms of Nygren in that regard.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
It's amazing how influential that book is, the
I'll tell
Nygren
you
book.
the truth. That book, I mean, that was a capitulation moment, so to speak. It revolutionized, or it's an inflection point, I should say, to term it better, right?
Yeah.
Because it affects everything that came after it, right? It did. Yes,
Yes.
sir.
Yes. Well, thanks so much. Byron,
Thank you.
ready to go?
Yeah, but I'm wondering again if it's okay if we stop and then start recording again.
Okay.
If I were, so the APA version will be recorded by Dan and my version by. Okay, guys, I'm all ready. Should we wait for Philip?
Why don't we get started, and then he'll come back when he's ready. Go ahead.
On his controversial 2006 book called Christian Faith and the Truth Behind 9/11. Now, this book was followed in the very same year, 2006, by A Call for Global Democracy as kind of a companion book, and that was called The American Empire and the Commonwealth of God. And what looks like his perhaps final statements on this issue of power politics have recently appeared, to my surprise, a systematic theology called The Christian Gospel for Americans, 2019, and then just a month ago, 2 months ago, Reinhold Niebuhr and the Question of Global Democracy. Now, a key to understanding the motivation behind Griffin's prodigious and transgressive output on political topics during this time of his retirement is the central role played, of course, by process theology. Griffin had established himself early on as one of the world's leading, probably the leading theorist of the nature of evil in the process world. And at least as we see and understand evil through the lens of Whitehead, again, I think that he's the leading theorist about the nature of evil and the demonic. In the aforementioned book, 2000 book, he addressed to Christians this theme, and he lets loose on the problem of evil with characteristic rigor, arguing that Christians have for centuries been lulled into fatalistic complacency about their own suffering and oppression. As we will see, this has occurred in large part because, as we've already been discussing, mainstream Christian